Good evening, everyone. My name is Monica Byrne Jimenez. I am the Executive Director of the University Council for Educational Administration. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to our second UCEA Presidential Lecture Series. We started this lecture series last year in the hopes of giving current presidents another opportunity to share their thinking about educational leadership and how and what ways they'd like to inform and shape the conversation happening in our field. This year, I'm happy that Carol Mullen, who's our current president, has decided to bring this topic to our attention. If you're here, it's because you, like we are concerned about the current situation, current attacks on the LGBTQIA+ community, and understand that this is a time for us to, on the one hand, advocate for and support our educators who are facing these issues, either themselves or have students who are doing that. But in order to do that, we need to learn and listen. And to do that, we've invited a panel to come speak to us today and share both their research, their experiences, their leadership, and implications for educational leadership broadly, but also in particular within UCEA. I'm so pleased to present our speakers for today. Carol A. Mullen, as I said, our current president, is one of our moderators at Virginia Tech University. You can wave, Carol. Jim Kushurik at Texas State University is also joining us as a moderator. Brian Duarte, who is currently at Ashland University, but moving to Purdue University. Melinda Mangan at Rutgers University. Judy Alston, currently at Ashland and moving to chair the Educational Leadership Department at Miami University. And DeMarcus Jenkins, currently at Penn State University and moving to University of Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of movement going on here. Thank you all. Welcome. Yes, Brian, I apologize. I got that wrong. Currently at Miami University and moving to Purdue University. But thank you all for being here. It's very important for us to hear from you, to learn from you, and hopefully inform the work that we continue to do as an organization and as a field. I will pass this over to Carol Mullen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. I appreciate this opportunity to focus this presidential lecture on any topic of my interest. And this is a topic that immediately came to mind for me: LGBTQIA+ solidarity, building gender expansive, affirming life worlds as agents of care. I'm very pleased that this amazing panel has agreed to meet with us today. They are generously giving of their time and energy to this event. So thank you to each and every one of you. We are eager for this conversation to take a step toward healthy climates and promising futures. And in this learning space of connection and expansiveness, no one is expected to be the expert, if you will. So we encourage our attendees, our guests, to experience this conversation with an open mind and respect the ideas that will be shared, knowing that some of the ideas may be difficult. The other thing I want to mention is when you consider the acronym LGBTQIA+, did you know that the A, which can stand for different things, can also stand for allyship? So it is in that spirit that I want to craft this talk around the panelists and what they have to share. We are going to turn to Jim, who is the co-facilitator, with the first prompt. Thank you, Jim. Please introduce yourself again.
Thanks, Carol. And before I start the first prompt, I would like to thank you and UCEA headquarters for, first of all, for pulling this panel together on such an important topic that really speaks to my soul. But also, Carol, I appreciate your inviting me to co-moderate this with you and to help to plan the panelists, etc. I don't think in all the 25 years or so that I have been attending UCEA, I think that this is the first time that we've actually done something like this on LGBTQIA+ topics. There's a bit of irony. 25 years ago, it never would have been possible. Nobody would have allowed it as a worthy topic of discussion or investigation. The organization started moving to a place where we had progressively more papers presented at the conference. We had a Gay Straight Alliance, a GSA group that would meet on Saturday mornings at 7 o'clock when no self-respecting gay person would look their best. And for the last 5 or 6 years, we've been invited to have critical conversations on these topics. And I know that I speak for all of us that we appreciate that space that UCEA is providing for us. This is not a panel about Jim Koshorik and his interests. This is a discussion where we'd like to involve the thoughts of a number of different people. Spirit of transparency, all of the panelists have been provided with a list of these questions in advance. And so the first one, and I would like to direct this to you, Judy, first. In your opinion, what might be the most pressing issues or laws facing LGBTQIA plus communities today?
Well, thank you. And it is really good to be here and to participate in this conversation. As Jim said, with UCEA, this is history making. It's great. I probably on this panel have been with UCEA the longest. I have been attending UCEA for 30 years. So it started in '93. But in reference to this question and thinking about, what are the issues and the laws? There's so many, right? There's so many things going on. And there was one quote that I read, and it's so true, that it said, "No issue has proved more vexing to this nation than the issue of race." And I say that as a scholar, a Black woman, Black lesbian scholar who does work on Black LGBTQ issues, that it always comes back to this issue of race, because that seems where everything starts. So then we add race to gender expression, sex, sexual orientation, all of these things. And then you have the intersections of these realities for a person in these targeted groups, and then it becomes combustible in the world. So the answer to the question is everything is pressing with all of these laws. And while we were at AERA, I was in a session that Adrian Dixon and it was Tandika Chapman had put together, and they were talking about this notion of a syndemic. Right. So we talk about the pandemic, but the syndemic is the aggregation. I'll read it for you. Aggregation of two or more concurrent or sequential epidemics or disease clusters in a population with biological interactions, which exacerbate the prognosis and burden of the disease. We have a disease of hate and evil in this country and in the world, which leads to these issues of these laws that they want to, put forth, and the way that people treat one another. Now, y'all know that I'm a preacher, so this is by kind of natural weaving of how my life is. These are the intersections of my identity. So it is this syndemic, or S-Y-N-demic, but it's also a syndemic, a S-I-N-demic of evil that is the problem in our world. And if we don't figure out a way to come together in these marginalized spaces, to come together to really control the discourse, then we will, as what Martin Niemöller said in his poem, when they came for, the notion of they came for the socialists and I didn't speak because I wasn't a socialist. They came for the trade unionists and I didn't speak because I wasn't a trade unionist. They came for the Jews, I didn't speak because I wasn't a Jew, then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. And if we don't get it together, that's where we'll be.
Thanks, Judy. Brian, the
Yeah, so I love that that's how Judy started, because that was one of the first things I wanted to mention about one of the most pressing issues is, you know, a lot of the anti-LGBT legislation that we were seeing recently is coupled with anti-critical race theory and that conversation that started off. So oftentimes these are lumped together as, quote, divisive concepts. So as queer people, we are not divisive concepts. We are humans, right? As queer people and as people of color, we're not, it's part of our humanity, but we've been labeled as divisive for whatever reason, which usually is, because we pose some sort of threat to normalization or mainstream society, or what's believed to be mainstream. And then I also took this question quite literally, and that these are the bills that I'm seeing right here in my home state of Indiana. People talk about Florida a lot. People talk about Texas a lot. People talk about red states a lot, and I think it's important to mention that I grew up in Massachusetts, and I watched the politics in my town where I grew up. And the exact same thing is happening. So while the state legislatures might not be proposing these things, there are parents at local school boards that are proposing similar things. So quite literally, the bills that we need to have on our radar are Don't Say Gay bills, which have been passed in Florida. We just passed one, or the governor just signed one here in Indiana. Sometimes that's limiting the discussion of sexuality or gender in certain grades. There's talk about expanding that. I think Florida initially banned it, for K through 3, and then expanded it thereafter. So that's something to be on the lookout for. Also, book banning. The reason why this is important is because representation matters, right? And so even for someone of my generation, there was not representation in books in middle and high school representing LGBT people, and that's problematic. And we've made a lot of progress in that area, where there's authors that are writing really great children's books about, children with same-sex parents and things. And so they're quite literally coming for that representation, which has all sorts of negative psychological effects on children, where they don't see themselves represented in the curriculum, or they, in many cases, don't see their parents or their families or loved ones represented. And then I think the scariest one of all is the gender-affirming care bans. And here in Indiana, when I read the text of that bill, what startled me the most is that therapy is considered a gender-affirming care practice. So you're literally making it illegal to provide therapy for children who are questioning their gender or sexuality. And the part that all of these bills have in common is that they're always believed to be about parent rights to what their children are exposed to. But the thing is that for students who are receiving gender affirming care, it's not only under the care of medical professionals, but it's with parental consent. And so what is forgotten in that argument is, what about the rights of the parents who are trying to affirm their children, where saying that this is about parental rights, but you're limiting the rights of not just LGBT people, but of allies to provide that. So and then the arguments are just ridiculous. Trans kids are not having surgeries. They may be getting hormone therapy with puberty blockers or testosterone, but again, it's all with parental consent. So I mention those things because if you don't know what those things are, I encourage you, and we'll get to what you can do in some of the other questions, but to look that up, because there's a lot of confusion about what gender affirming care really means. And I think confusion exclusion leads to passivity and in terms of allowing the laws to be passed.
Thank you, Brian. DeMarcus, same question.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And thank you, Judy and Brian, for your comments. I think both of you hit sort of the nail on the head, kind of where I wanted to enter in the conversation. I think first, I think it's important and necessary to point out that anti-LGBTQ policies and legislation is rooted in the same settler colonial and white supremacist logic that anti-Blackness is rooted in. So I think if we start to trace the history of the roots of these ideas, we see the necessary linked fate and synergy that I think it requires to disband and to address these sorts of legislations and policies. And I think that's extremely important and a point that I don't want us to miss in this conversation. So I think that's critical. The second piece that I think is really important is what, along the lines of what Brian brought up, is the part of the logics that these policies and legislation is rooted in is this notion of hate, right? And I think we can see these in a couple of different ways. And when I say hate, I'm also thinking just hate and violence, right? I think on the one hand, we can see sort of state level and national level policy that attempt to erase the existence of trans and gender non-conforming people, right? We see like that as an act of violence, that as an act of fate. And then also on the other side, I think really necessary to contend with the fatal violence against LGBTQ folks that are happening in the streets every single day. And I think about, for example, what's happening in the state I live in Pennsylvania, where sexual orientation and gender identity are not protected characteristics in hate crime laws. And I think about that right now as I think about Marquise M.J. Jackson, who was recently killed in Philadelphia on his birthday in December of 2022, right? And I think when we see these things happening in our streets and we see our communities being impacted by them, and we see the laws that are quicker to move to erase and invisibilize LGBTQ people and not moving as swiftly to address the violence that these communities face, I think that is perpetual harm that LGBTQ people constantly face within sort of our nation. And I think for me, it's really what's necessary is a compounded approach that addresses both the violence that is written and legislated in state and federal laws, but also the violence that we see on the streets that have taken the lives of so many Black, queer, and trans individuals across this country.
Thanks, DeMarcus. Melinda.
Wow, I've got a tough act to follow here. Let me first say thanks to everyone. And I also wanted to kind of set my own positionality. I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. And my research focuses on how to, as a cisgender woman, my research focuses on how we can create more supportive, affirming environments for trans youth in our schools. I'm particularly interested in the role that cis folks have in trying to do this work and contributing to solution finding rather than casting trans folks, trans children in particular, as the problem. So we have covered a lot of territory. We've begun full throttle. I really want to thank Brian for this aspect of divisiveness. And I think this is one of the things that really troubles me the most right now is the notion that LGBTQ folks, this is a divisive topic, right? That there's somehow up for debate. I'm concerned about the ways in which misinformation is being utilized. And in particular, the way that false information is masquerading as difference of opinion, right? There are topics here that are not debatable, and the way they're being framed as delicate or sensitive or potentially divisive issues, I think is a huge problem. And I think one of the things we need to do as a field is to figure out how we can capture that narrative and shift it so that we are locating the problem in the right place, which is in the structures of our schools. And the school cultures that we develop and perpetuate. And I'm going to leave it at that because we have a lot of really great questions here. So Jim, thanks for getting us started.
Thanks, Melinda. Before we go on to the next question, There are a couple of questions that have been posed in the Q&A section. So I will throw this question out to anybody who wants to answer it. And please, you don't all have to feel obliged to do that. Just if you have any thoughts that come up. So Sherry Castillo asked, as a researcher in Texas who works with transgender and non-binary youth, what are the best ways I can mitigate any trauma my participants may be faced with because of my interview questions?
I'd like to jump in there. I think this is really important for us as researchers to think about our positionality and think about the ways in which we can intersect with research topics. In my own research, I have made a decision not to interview transgender children. I have concerns about resurfacing traumas, asking children to put words to their negative experiences. And that's a personal choice that I've made for myself. I don't know that it's the right choice for all folks. And I think we do need to hear from children. We need to hear their experiences, but doing it in a way that doesn't try to over trauma, I think is a really important consideration. So I really appreciate that, that question.
Yeah, and I think I have comments that build on that, because I constantly reflect and think about in the work that I do as a Black researcher, doing research in primarily Black communities, primarily Black low-income communities. I am constantly thinking about sort of this notion of perpetual testifying, where so many people who've been depressed by systemic inequalities are constantly called on to testify about their disenfranchisement or the ways in which they have been neglected by social and structural policies. So I'm constantly reflecting on what does it mean for me to do the work that I want to do, and also subjecting the people who I am in community with to retelling their stories over and over again to another researcher and reliving their trauma. And how might I think about questions, at least in my qualitative research, that allow my participants to center joy, to center their humanity, to center parts of their life that affirm who they are in their being. And so I think one of the decisions I make as a researcher is to start there, is sort of to move away from research that, as Eve talks about, damage-centered research, and to move to scholarship and phrase my questions in a way that allows my participants, or invites my participants to talk about hope and dreams and aspirations and fugitivity and self-determination and agency. And those are the topics I think that I use as a starting point and an entry into my research, my qualitative research with participants especially.
DeMarcus, that reminds me, back 15 or 20 years ago, almost every article that came out on LGBTQ issues started off with the statistics of how many of these kids have tried to commit suicide and how many have died, and it was all focused on the negativity. And there was a group at UCEA and AERA that just challenged that kind of approach to the research and said, we need to be focusing our research on these issues of joy, on these issues of resistance, on these issues of resiliency, rather than all the negative things. And so it's encouraging to hear you have that sort of focus in your work. I'm going to ask David's question of the panelists. Allison has also had a question, but I'll hold off on that until after the next prompt. David Osworth says, as a queer scholar, this is important work to me. How might we build a groundswell so that cishet scholars are engaging in work surrounding LGBTQ+ issues with fidelity? I think there are $64,000 associated with this question.
Well, in that case, I I think that, this conversation is a good starting point. I thank Dr. Mullen for using the presidential lecture as an opportunity to move this issue forward. It's so timely. But recently, there was a panel maybe a year or two ago that was through ARA Division A presidential series as well. So, the conversations are happening. I just worry about the action part of it. So I think we need to continue to have them, but we really need to push one another and hold one another accountable for the action part. Because, it's been 7 years since O'Malley and Capper's article, which quite literally read our social justice programs for filth by saying that we're LGBT plus exclusive in them. And so I can tell you the programs that I'm teaching in haven't revised the curriculum to include LGBT stuff, right? And, I do it in my classroom because it's important to me, but David raises a really important question that I don't, the urgency isn't always there for cishet folks. And I've talked to folks too that also feel like they need to be invited to the conversation. I would say, this is an open invitation. I'm inviting you to do it. But I think that the part of the issue is that it takes a lot of effort, right, to engage with that. And there's a little bit of not resistance, but reluctancy, I would think, from cis folks, because they don't feel like experts or knowledgeable about the issue, right? But I think what we need to realize is we've done a better job. There's still work to do. We've done a better job of being like inclusive of race and gender writ large in curriculum. I've seen a lot of pushes for like decolonizing syllabi and things like that. I think people need to ask themselves, like, if they've followed that trend of decolonizing their syllabus, have they also de-cis heteroized their syllabus as well, right? So that needs to be included, but we need to have these conversations and continue to do it, and continue to do it despite the resistance that you're going to see, because there's always going to be students in our classes that don't want to have these difficult conversations, or they may say things like, sexuality doesn't belong in education, or my personal favorite, oh, trans students, we don't have that in my school, right? We need to continue to like push back on that, and maybe call on some folks who are doing work to see if they'd be willing to speak in your classes. I'm not going to volunteer anyone on the panel. I'll volunteer myself. But I'm happy to do that. It is an additional labor, but it's one that I'm willing to do. So just be mindful of that, but also, be willing to call on folks when you're totally at a loss. But also go to the LGBT sessions at UCEA when you go to the conference. Go to the LGBT sessions at ARA. There's a great queer SIG. You don't have to be queer to be in the queer SIG. If this is an important issue for you, then there's a lot of kind of personal things that you have to do, like about just educating yourself, and if it's not your research agenda, do some literature review on what's out there, because there is a lot already out there that would be useful to students. And I encourage folks who are cishet scholars that want to engage with this work in their classrooms, use Journal of Cases in Educational Leadership, which recently highlighted several articles on LGBT issues, and they're very well equipped for providing activities where aspiring school leaders can grapple with these issues.
Thanks, Brian.
Sorry, just to add to that really briefly, I think another really good practice that I encourage programs and departments to do is engage in a collective syllabus review. And I think a moment like that is where you offer vulnerability to bring your syllabus with your colleagues and have an honest conversation about who's represented and who's not, whose knowledge production is valued and who's not, what topics get covered in a week and what topics are consistent throughout the semester's syllabi, right? And I think that's an opportunity to as a unit to sort of reflect on the knowledge that is being prioritized in the department or in the program and say, hey, we might need to really think about this differently. And this will take a collective effort. And I think that's sort of a way, especially for those who feel like I'm not an expert in this topic, this isn't my research area, this is something I know a lot about. I think this is a way for colleagues to come together and really recognize that none of us are doing this 100% right all the time, and we learn from each other, right? And I think sort of as a way to bring our ideas to the table and engage in a collective review of our syllabi and a workshop around what ideas that we are teaching and what ideas are we contributing to the disappearing of, and how might we rectify that within our unit? How can we sort of use that as a moment to align what we teach with who we say we are and what values we aspire? Like, I think that that's really important. And I think in the hustle and bustle of the everyday faculty life, I think we miss those moments to take a step back and say, let's have these hard conversations about how we may be invisibilizing particular sets of knowledge or groups of people, and let's be intentional about rectifying that.
Thanks, Marcus. Carol, would you like to take the next prompt?
Thanks, Jim.
Prompt.
Do that. And then we'll swing back to the Q&A. And we appreciate the questions that are being put into the Q&A chat box, so keep them coming. Panelists, regarding our second question, what do you think are some effective ways that educational leaders, such as school principals, can support, protect, and advocate for LGBTQIA+ young people, some of which has already been touched upon? Brian, would you like to start, please?
Sure. So, my research area and generally uses critical policy analysis, and one of the major components of critical policy analysis is resistance to or engagement with policies. So I think we have to think about this term of resistance because I think that's where the opportunities lie, right? Particularly if you're living in a state that's passing this type of legislation. So I think one thing that's effective for leaders to do is to begin by reading up on the bills, and don't just read, the headlines, because the headlines are often make the bills sound very scary. And, as a queer person, they are very scary. But when you read the text of the bill, they're often a little bit like, like I read one recently where they're like, oh, they're taking all of these books out of the children's section in the library. Well, they are taking the books off of the shelves, but they're not like burning them. They're putting them in a separate section of the library, which is ridiculous. No matter how you look at it, right? But it's less evil than it's made out to sound, because the books aren't like totally banned. They're just, no longer in the children's section. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they couldn't be put in the hands of a child, is what I'm saying. So it's kind of an example of like reading the law and determining where the opportunities are to work within the law. Judith Butler says, within the terms of the law. And I always repeat that phrase of like, what can we do, right, within the terms of the law? A lot of the bills have no teeth, they have no accountability. And so recently I was speaking to a principal here in Indiana who was like, well, am I supposed to be taking books off of the shelves in the library? Like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be doing that. Nobody's told me that I'm supposed to be doing that. So I'm just going to do nothing. And this is sort of the, as I've written in a paper before, passive resistance, that can work in a way, right? It's like, and she's like, well, if anyone asks me about it, I'll just make it look like I did something. And I think ed leaders and just educators in general tend to think that they don't have a lot of autonomy, but they are, as mid-level managers, they do have quite a bit of control of what happens in their four walls. And so there's ways, and I did it when I was a teacher too, of like, you close your door and you kind of do what you think is right, and you don't advertise what you're doing. And so I think everybody in their position of leadership can see certain opportunities to still do right by kids. And I think that that's kind of what we need in cases, in states where things have already been passed. We have to look now, we've already protested at the state capitol and that didn't work. So now we have to look for ways around the system. And that's, quite literally what queer people have been doing for decades, right? There's a reason why there's a gay bar. It's because every bar is a straight bar and we needed our own space. So as cishet leaders, we need cishet leaders to carve out their own space to be advocates within the terms of the law.
Thank you very much for your comments, Brian. DeMarcus?
Yeah, shy from saying buck the system, right? And do what you got to do in the name of equity for your children. Part of what I think is necessary is like education leaders, and this is at the school and district level, to really sift through the misinformation that's out there. I think teachers are sort of educating within a context where there's a lot of noise around these bills and this legislation. There is so much misinformation about what can happen, what cannot happen, what should happen, what the consequences are if X happens, right? Like there's a lot of information out there, and much of it is false, and a lot of it is second and third hand. And I think lots of too many decisions are being made by principals and teachers without the explicit knowledge and understanding necessary to make the right and appropriate decisions, right? So I think one of the things I argue that school leaders and district leaders can do is actually sit down with the language of the legislation. Engage in a workshop with your faculty around what does this say and what does this mean? And have very clear and some level of consensus about, as a school community, what are we deciding to do with this, and bring in folks from the district and other folk who can support and really help with that work, right? Like, I think, to the point of, Brian brings up the point of like moving the books to a different bookshelf and not necessarily burning them. Like, absolutely. And also there's fear that if I touch that book, then I might lose my job. Or if I teach from that book, then I might get in trouble. And it's like, actually, maybe not, right? And I think part of these bills and the work of these bills and this legislation is to generate fear, is to sort of imagine a folk devil, right? And I wrote about this in a recent paper with some colleagues and students from Wisconsin, is to create this folk devil as a way to create mass hysteria, essentially to get folk to do nothing, right? To force people into fear that is debilitating, so that inaction occurs. And I think one of the ways that we can really start to support our leaders, both school, district, and local leaders, is to have honest conversations with the legislation, with the written words, so that we know, so that there is insight and knowledge about actually where the possibilities are, and sort of breathing life into those instances where possibilities may be lying dormant.
Thank you. Terrific. Yeah. Melinda?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because I work with principals on a day-to-day basis, and they want to know what can I do? When I conducted my research in 20 different school districts and worked with administrators who are really trying to create inclusive schools for gender diverse children. Those principals told me that their fears were big and they weren't realized when they actually enacted practices that were supportive. Now, people will say to me, oh, that was before the current wave. But I remind folks, that was after Trump rescinded the Office of Civil Rights policy supporting and protecting trans kids. So there was a wave of fear at that time. Things might be on a grander scale in the sense of we see more legislative bills at the state level, but principals have shown me that they can make progress. I'm in New Jersey where, it's a blue state and you would think everybody's supportive. That is not the case. We have 600 school districts. Principals tell me again and again, they've got activists in their school boards. They've got people who are looking over their shoulder in a very real way. And, they're concerned about job security. And, I try not to poo-poo that and say, oh, stand up and, do what's right, because I think we want those educators in our schools. So we need to figure out a way to keep those proactive educators embedded in schools and in a way that is supporting students. So, from my research, one of the low-hanging fruits is to decrease the gendered practices in a school. That means, suggesting new ways of having bathroom passes, new ways of lining up, shifting from ballroom dancing to square dancing. These are small things, but they're meaningful things. When you're a kid who isn't sure if you're going to line up in the boy line or the girl line or which bathroom you're going to go to, that idea of decreasing gendered practices can be really meaningful for children. And I feel when I talk to principals, they feel like they're doing something. They might not be able to get out their rainbow flag, but they're trying to create competencies and practices in their schools that are starting to create more space for a wider variety of genders.
Yeah, thank you very much, Melinda. Judy?
So just thinking about everything that has been said, one of the things is the idea of educating yourself, right? Because we can talk about what we do in leadership preparation programs, what's on paper, how we define ourselves, who we say we are versus who we really are. But it's really about administrators and teachers also taking the onus upon themselves outside of the training that they receive to really educate themselves. If they say that they want to foster a sense of belonging and connectedness in a school for all children, belonging and connectedness for all children so that they can be successful, then does all really mean all, right? We always like to, all children can learn. I used to hate that line, right? Yes, they can, but all you teachers don't want to teach, right? All you leaders don't want to lead. You don't want to deal with the difficult spaces. You don't want to deal with those that are outside of the lines, outside of the margin. So if we want to foster this sense of belonging and connectedness, then you have to take that onus on yourself to educate yourself and get the real deal. Under exactly what Marcus and Brian are saying, you got to read it to see what's there. But here's the problem. And I know all of us can raise our hands as professors. How many times have we heard our students say, I haven't read a book since I was in middle school. I haven't read, I read a couple paragraphs or when I was in college, and it weird as a sense of pride. Like you've made it through life without really reading a book, but yet and still you're the leader of a school or you're teaching in a school. You have to educate yourself. You have to, if you want to have this sense, build this culture of respect, because that's what we have to do in schooling. You have to build a culture of respect, and in doing that, you have to model that behavior as a leader and as a teacher. So you want healthy social relationships, healthy relationships in school, then you have to model that as the teacher, as the leader in the building as well. But it starts with the self. and the self-education.
And I can feel the groundswell as you speak about another way to get at the groundswell. Allison has asked a question in the Q&A. She's written out quite a bit. She's saying that she's working on a research project with elementary teachers to develop resources for students pursuing a multiple subject credential in California to understand the laws and policies that guide the inclusion or lack thereof of gender and sexuality in K-6 classrooms. Unsurprisingly, much of what we're finding, she says, is that many teachers have received incorrect information from supervisors and administrators who are also often ill-prepared to understand relevant law and policy. So what are your thoughts, anybody who might want to respond, about how to best address this gap in knowledge, or less generously, lack of advocacy on the part of educational leaders? So is there anything that you might say there in terms of where she also expands and says, even in states where LGBTQIA+ rights should be more protected? Anyone would like to say something there?
I think Judy already said it. We need to read more, right? Read more, read trans authors, trans journalists, trans resources, and just any kinds of books out there. Allison, you know me. I hope you've seen my book. If you want me to come and do a book study with your teachers, I'd be happy to do that. I do that for free. I'm always happy to help teachers and administrators think about how they can shift their practices in schools.
I think related to that, a couple of things come to mind. One is this sort of disrupting this sort of hierarchical relationship in schools where it's the leader down to the teachers. So I think that there are ways in which, when we are transmitting knowledge, teachers, if when you're doing this work and you are passionate about this in schools, I think there are opportunities to teach up, if you will, right? And there to work differently with your school leader so that things that you as teachers are observing in the classroom, experience they're having in direct connection with students, sharing that with the admin at the school and making sure that there are sort of interventions or responses built in, right? So I think that's one thing. I think too, that question makes me think about the work that we need to do as those who prepare school leaders to be able to go in schools and have the tools necessary to be principals, school leaders, and advocates, right? And what does that mean to be an advocate for your students and your school community that extends beyond the school walls, right? And Terrence Green has done some work around that as well, right? So really just starting to think about, like, what does it mean to be an advocate that is not only confined by the brick and mortar school building, but extends beyond that, and that gets us into policy spaces, that gets us into showing up at school board meetings, that gets us into doing responsibilities and advocacy that extends beyond sort of leading within the traditional confines of a school building.
Jim, would you like to take the next prompt? And then after that, we can respond to Claudia, or you can begin with Claudia.
Actually, we have a number of questions in the Q&A, so I will start with Claudia's question for the panel. Claudia says, I acknowledge each of you as well-known and respected scholars and leaders in the field. How do I, as a trans non-binary administrator in Colorado and aspiring scholar, embed myself in the work? How do people at this phase grow our impact and advocacy of our youth in schools and collaboration potential? I'm at the pre-published phase of my dissertation titled Liberation and Inclusion of Trans Youth, a Phenomenological Approach. This is a celebratory study informed by trans scholars and informed by Sarah Ahmed's desire-based approaches.
I think that there are different ways that educators go about that. Part of that might mean creating safe spaces and carving out fugitive spaces where folk who feel marginalized or disenfranchised can have, spaces that are inclusive and that are provided for them, right? And at the same time, I'm careful here because we know history has shown us what happens when such spaces are institutionalized and not created by those who need them the most, right? So I also struggle with what that might mean in terms of creating safe spaces or doing that sort of work from a top-down approach. It has to sort of emerge from those who desire that, right, and can uplift that. So I think that's one thing. I think ultimately I also just think about the teaching bans and the legislation around that is essentially a gag order for teachers. And when I think about it that way, I think that those approaches necessitate a bold response. And I think in many ways, those responses are contextualized by the realities of your school district and state. Ultimately, I think that one of the most important things that is necessary is, again, getting outside of the school. And that might mean speaking up at school board meetings. That might mean being more active in your teachers union, especially those that are pushing for more progressive and inclusive policies. I think that sort of behavior, I think those sort of commitments is a way to push back on certain policies that are coming down that are essentially used to silence educators and educators' political affiliations.
Thanks, DeMarcus. Melinda.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, I think at the core, we need to be teaching critical thinking skills. When folks have critical thinking skills, they can see that there is an inherent hypocrisy between saying parents should have the right to decide what books their children read at school, and at the same time, eliminating parents' rights from deciding how the medical treatment that their children receive. So, I think critical thinking skills, again, administrators, teachers don't always feel like they can be waving the rainbow flag, but there are other ways in which we can build a skill set and competencies that are the underlying practices of being able to think and challenge some of these inequities. And facts, we need facts. We have this incredible misinformation age right now, and trying to help our young people understand how to navigate social media and distill misinformation from fact. We keep hearing this logic of difference of opinion, when really these aren't differences of opinion. These are discrimination and bias that dehumanize people and allow us to enact policies that enact violence on whole groups of people. 29 medical associations support trans-affirming medical care. 29. There isn't really a debate. There is no difference of opinion. So I think we need to continue to arm ourselves with facts and teach these critical thinking skills to our students, if we have leaders in our classroom, if we have teachers in our classroom, as well as all the way down to pre-K 3. But yeah, critical thinking skills for sure.
Thanks, Melinda. Judy.
Which question are we on?
We're on 3.
Okay, I was looking for a quote and I can't find it. Melinda said, something about facts and this age of misinformation. I'm gonna mess this up horribly, but people have a way of saying things in life as if it is true without anything to back it up. And then other people accept it as truth. So we look at the sky and we say it's blue, but somebody else comes along and says it's purple. And then people just believe that. And so we have this problem of not, again, this goes back to the notion of educating oneself and understanding who you are at your core and your way of knowing in the world. Because otherwise, then you're just following along like a bunch of lemmings, which is which seems to be the case in education in a lot of ways, because it becomes, well, that's not my problem. I have to deal with this right here. That's so I can't, we've got kids who need to eat. We got to get their lunch ready. I can't deal with those other issues and the pride flag and all of those things, but not understanding it's a whole thing. It's a whole picture. It's a whole entity. And as leaders and those who are stakeholders in this, you've got to look at the larger picture. Now, you may find your space to do the work that you've been called to do, but the work that each of us has been called to do impacts the larger picture. And so when I say I don't want to see anything about LGBTQI stuff in my school, yeah, but what about those kids in the school that are LGBTQIA or their parents? So are you saying that you don't care about them? And if you're saying that, then just say it. Let's just be honest. Just say, I don't care about that, and therefore. So then then that's a different conversation we can have. And then that's a different way to approach it.
Thanks, Judy. Brian.
Yeah, so in terms of like explicitly providing some examples of how we could deal with the bans, a lot of this isn't new. There's a whole wave of states that have adopted what was called no promo homo laws. And Texas was one of them when I was a teacher in Texas. So that's why my principal was able to tell me to stay back and to stay in the closet. But that wasn't actually being, enforced by anyone. There were other schools in San Antonio that were flying pride flags. And so that's a direct violation of no promo homo law. So I think as school leaders, you have to consider where are you and what are you able to get away with? Because in communities like San Antonio, you're probably not going to get a lot of pushback for not complying with the law. So if you're in one of those states, great, keep doing what you're doing, right? Or one of those districts or schools, keep doing what you're doing. Then, if you have the unfortunate position of being in a place where it's not so free, that's where you have to be a little bit more covert about it. So I've heard about school leaders who are like, oh, we can't call it the Gay Straight Alliance anymore, or we can't call it the Pride Club anymore. Okay, call it something else. The kids will and school leaders have done this in Florida, right? They've just renamed it, and kids know exactly what it is. And so they're still able to get that support, but it's being done in a way that it's not going to raise any red flags. And one of the things that I did as a teacher who wanted to be out but was told I shouldn't be out is I just put a picture of my partner and I front and center on a bookshelf in my classroom. So, the kids knew that this was my family. And they also sadly knew not to ask about it because they knew I couldn't talk about it. But there was an unwritten rule, and for the queer students in the room, it was just a subtle message of like, hey, I'm here too, and I'm also living in this state. Because a lot of people want to say like, oh, this is so terrible, we need to leave these states, or California wants to like ban academics from using their travel funding to go to conferences that are in states that have passed these things. Well, that's great for California, but I'm living here. I wake up every morning in Indiana. So we can't some of us don't have the luxury to just like run away from it all. And so sometimes it's just kind of sending those subtle messages to kids so that they don't feel totally hopeless, because it is a hopeless feeling of feeling like, wow, my identity is being banned from this state. So if we can just at least subtly give them the message that they're welcome here, it is kind of, pardon me for saying it like this, but it is kind of shitty that we have to do it that way. But if that's what we have to do, I think it's kind of the best we can do in the current climate to support kids, rather than just, being totally afraid and doing exactly what they want us to do. They want us to be afraid when we see the legislation, and they want us to pull the books off our shelves, and they want us to stop having the pride clubs. But rather than doing that, we have to find ways to continue to have that representation, just in ways that, it's not going to get us in trouble.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask another one of the questions in the Q&A. Corey Rosa asks, from my dissertation research, my school leader participants are challenged to contend with the religious liberties asserted by some while also supporting those who are queer. For instance, the acknowledgement and use of pronouns at school. What should those school leaders know, do, read, etc.?
I can jump in. What I've learned from my principals who are doing this work in the field is religious liberties are individual liberties. They are about a person's own choices. And so the principals that I work with, when disgruntled parents come into the classroom or come into the building and say, I don't want my kid saying their pronouns. Well, fine. Your child does not have to share their pronouns, but that doesn't preclude other children from being able to share their pronouns. So, that's how some of my savvy administrators seem to be handling it. That extends to, all these things like what they wear, dress up, the dress up box, etc. Trying to confine it to, you have your religious liberties for your own religious beliefs, but everyone else does as well.
Yeah, related to pronouns, I would just add, here in Indiana, the latest Don't Say Gay bill requires teachers to notify parents if a child changes their pronouns. So that's, part of it. The argument for that is religious liberty and whatnot. But here's a very simple thing that teachers can do when a parent changes or when a student changes their pronouns. Just pretend not to hear it and then call the student by the pronouns. You don't have to call. Or if you're in a school, like I had a school where they watched everything we did and we had a call log, call the parent and log it, right? And so you have a record and just be like, hey, I just want to let you know that so-and-so had a really great day. They got an A on their quiz today. There's a log that you called the parent. No one has to know what was discussed in that meeting. And so you're following kind of what they're asking you to do. But I mean, it's like, why would you have to tell the parent? And then if on the other end, if I was a parent and my child changed their pronouns and then the teacher called me, I would be like, why are you calling me to tell me this? So you're one of those teachers that wants to follow the law. Why? Because, I think if you're following these laws, I think you're outing yourself as somebody who's in favor of them.
Carol, do you want to go to the next prompt?
Sure, and I want to say that I'm enjoying hearing about all these creative workarounds, both individually and collectively. So that's one of the things I just want you to know is a real takeaway for me so far. So our next question is, can you tell us about LGBTQIA+ advocacy groups, agendas, and campaigns that may or may not be in the news that you think are worth knowing about and why? And if we could start with Melinda, that would be great.
Yeah, so the great thing about our digital world is there are tons of resources out there. Some of my favorite resources are the Trans Educator Network of Texas right now is really active. Really exciting to follow what they're doing. They are protesting at the state legislature. So there's some really interesting work there. They also have resources for teachers on their website. Also, on a more national level, the National Center for Trans Equality really does state by state statistics, as well as employment resources, family legal counsel. It really just has everything for families who are having to navigate our current world. Gender Spectrum is a great resource for teachers as well as for families. It has some classroom toolkits. And another one is the Human Rights Campaign. Again, they have classroom toolkits that teachers can adapt lessons that are tackling some of these tough issues.
Thank you for those specifics. Judy?
I'm with Melinda on this. Google is your friend. We live in a time where you can, and you got smartphones, you got everything. All you got to do is type in a couple of words and all kinds of things will come up. I don't have specific places to tell people, but it's real easy to find this information nowadays. And that's the beauty of living in this age and time, is that you can do that. And then but you can also, connect with local organizations that are in your cities that will, then extend your connections even more, or people that in your cities or in an institution. Authors, just like Melinda just offered a little while ago, she does her trainings for free. And that's really important to know, because that doesn't happen often, right? But again, that's a part of the call that she has for her life and the work that she does. So it's easy to do the research to find these organizations and groups. And when you find one, ask the question of them and they'll connect you to another.
Oh, good to know. Hey, Brian?
Yeah, so I think this is a really great question. I have a list of resources that I can share, but I don't have the ability to share in the chat, so I can send them out afterwards. But I think, one of the things is it's really demoralizing when you're, protesting these bills at the state level, and then you hear like 4 hours of testimony and it's overwhelmingly against the bill, and then it passes anyway, right? And so one of the ways that I've gotten over that is by filling my social media fields with folks who are doing really awesome resistance and activist work on the ground, locally and in places like Florida. We all like to kind of sit and scroll through Instagram or Twitter when, after a long day. And so what I've done over the past couple of years is I've sort of purged my social media from things that were not really, helpful to me. And now it's sort of like a learning space. So I found a bunch of folks who are local, who are either former teachers. There's someone named Anna Sutter, who's a former teacher and a former school counselor in Indiana, and she's very vocal against these bills and talking about ways to work within them. There's an organization called Mad Voters in Indiana that is educational advocacy group for folks. So there's a lot of like TikTokers who are out there that are talking about these issues, and you can follow them and you can learn a lot from them. I encourage folks to look for local LGBT youth organizations. Here in Indianapolis, we have a wonderful organization called Indiana Youth Group, and I volunteer there a couple times a month. I encourage you all, especially cishet folks that want to get involved, to volunteer at these organizations, so you get to meet some youth and you can learn so much from these kids. Just about, who they are and what's important to them. And it's also, for me, it's sort of like therapy, because it's like, okay, people are out here still existing and resisting. And so that's important to see, right? But then it's also helpful because it can kind of arm you with all of these tools for what to do in your own setting of like, oh, how to create, like you might not have ever thought of renaming the GSA, but that's something that I've learned that other people are doing in other states. So then I'm like, oh, okay, if that works in Florida, then that'll work here, right? So I encourage you to search for that. The Jack Pettox is a 18-year-old student activist who was suspended from Flagler High School for staging a walkout after the Don't Say Gay bill. He's now a very well-known activist. His friend down in Miami, Max Fenning, is the president and founder of Prism Florida, who is providing educational opportunities, inclusive educational opportunities for LGBT and youth of color. So that's really, these kids are quite literally fighting against Ron DeSantis, and I think that's badass. So find who those people are on social media, follow them. You can learn a lot from them, and also, it's sort of a chain where they'll share posts from other folks, and you just sort of slowly build up. Where when you're sitting down passively, kind of scrolling, you're actually learning while you're doing it, and it's a way to get involved without doing too heavy of a lift.
Cool. Thank you. DeMarcus?
Yeah, I think I echo what's been shared, is that there are lots of resources that are available, and they're not too hard to find. I think different, you can do an internet search and that would sort of lead you to them. I know Twitter is also a really great place to find community and resources that do this, that are supportive for LGBTQIA plus concerns and questions. One that I would like to elevate in this conversation is the Trevor Project. I really appreciate the Trevor Project. They offer a number of different services. One of them is around suicide prevention, which I think, it's, given everything that comes down that's coming down, like sometimes we just make sure we're checking in with our mental health, and they provide an avenue for that. I think another interesting and valuable resource with the Trevor Project is they provide guidance and insights on how to have difficult conversations around race and gender identity. So if you are sort of trying to communicate, especially for young people, trying to communicate the intersections of Blackness with their LGBTQ identity against a backdrop of religion, within the Black family and other ways we've seen religion show up for different people. The Trevor Project offers guidance on how to enter those conversations, and some support there. And then another piece related to what Brian said is the Trevor Project also works to think about social media as an inclusive space for those LGBTQ identifying people who are unable to find sort of local community. They help you to sort of think about social media to be in a space where you can find community, where you can navigate that to find friends that are both near domestically and also international. So I think that's a great resource that has lots of legs and lots of supports there.
Kind of therapeutic, provides that option. Interesting. We're going to look at the Q&A, Stuart. And before we read Stuart's prompt or question, I just want to say we've been asked about the recording and where it will be posted. And when Monica sums up and has something to say at the end, perhaps she can talk about the recording and where, and even maybe when it will be posted. So Stuart asked, how do you create safe spaces in educational settings, not just for the K through 12 students, but for teachers and others from unknowing parents who want to impose their beliefs on everyone in the building, and by default, create more danger and trauma for LGBTQ students and others? Would any panelists like to respond to that? Sounds like there might be some personal experience.
That is a tough one. Because schooling and what's going on in buildings today is so different, in that the way the behavior is manifested. there's nothing new under the sun. So the issues that we have now, we've had them before, but people feel empowered and entitled to come into that space and talk to teachers and administrators any damn way they feel. They just, it's like, and I always likened it to an episode of the Cosby Show when Rudy was deciding that she was not going to go to 4th grade. She was going to quit school after 3rd grade. And Vanessa said, well, you won't get a job. You can't do that. She said, yeah, I will. She said, what will you do? She said, I can teach 3rd grade because I was there, right? So we have people who look at our profession and think that because they have sat in a desk in some school anywhere USA at some point, that they actually know what's going on and that they can be in charge and they can tell us what to do because this is what I believe. Forgetting that this is a social experiment that we are in, and so everything is there. It's a microcosm of the world inside the school building, and so what you must have are administrators and school leaders who will not allow that to happen in their schools. Somebody has got to stand up and put their big girl panties on and say, this is not going to happen on my watch in my building. You cannot come in here and talk to my teachers any way that you feel like. You will. We have a culture of respect. And because of this culture of respect, then that means we respect all in here, even the ones we disagree with. We still respect that because they are another human being and they have that right. But your right does not overlay your rights, and which you believe does not overlay what we are trying to do in this building with all of these students so that they can go out into the world to be productive human beings.
Thank you very much. Jim, would you like to carry on?
Yes, and I'm aware of the time. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left. So I'm going to jump forward to the last prompt. And we'll start with DeMarcus. What message or takeaway might you want to leave with our interested audience of educational leaders?
You really threw a whammy there. I was waiting 5 seconds. Here we go. I think for me, what has sort of illuminated in this conversation takes me back to something I learned very early on in my teaching when I was a high school teacher. And it's the idea that teaching is political work. Through your teaching, through your pedagogy, and through your silences, you are demonstrating your political ideas and affiliations and your belief systems, and those things are translated in the classroom and in the spaces that you occupy. And I think that for me, one of the things that I really press upon the educators that I work with and the aspiring educators that I work with is having a core sense, a concrete sense of what you stand for and who you are when you do this work. You want to stand toes deep in it, right? And I think given the violence that we've articulated that is coming down from state legislation, from at the national level, I think it becomes even more important for us to check in with ourselves and who we are as educators and our political commitments and how they show up in our classrooms, on what things we are deciding to do, what things we are deciding not to do, and have that honest and frank conversation with yourself. And I think that is where, I think that is where the true transformation begins to happen. And for me, it's about, if I am deciding that this commitment is part and parcel of who I am as an educator, and this commitment could be elevating the voices of those who are being forced into silence, or if this commitment is to ensuring that representation matters in my classroom, or if it's ensuring that all my students, regardless of how they identify, race, class, gender, sexual orientation, or otherwise, feel welcomed and affirmed and loved in my space. If these are my commitments, then that's the hill that I climb, and that's the hill from which I do my work. People say die on. I believe that that's the hill in which we live on. And for me, I really try to one of the tasks we do in all my classrooms is we center our commitments and we articulate them and we commit to our commitments. And I think for me, that is the very core of what will move the needle, the very core of what will bring about the type of change that we envision. I think that is sort of what resonates in Freedom Dreams. I think that is what fugitivity is all about. And most importantly, I think that's how we center possibility in our work.
Thank you very much, DeMarcus. Melinda.
I will try to be brief because so many amazing insights have already been offered. Educate yourself, right? First and foremost. But also, this is not a niche topic. This is not a statistically insignificant field of study. Gender intersects with race, disability, citizenship, sexual orientation. All these marginalized identities intersect with one another. So when you think of it in that kind of compounding way, this really is not insignificant. This is a topic that all educational researchers and ed leaders should be thinking about. I can guarantee this range of topics touches every single one of the kids in our schools. The most recent research out of the Williams Institute showed that 27% of youth identify as gender nonconforming. 27%. No matter how you slice it, kids should be leading the way, and we need to figure out how to do this better because they have it figured out. We're mucking it up here on the adult end. So we just need to get out of the way and let these amazing young people lead.
Thanks, Melinda. Judy.
Yeah, I echo what my colleagues both have just said. Again, educate yourself. You've got to educate yourself. In the movie, The Glass Onion, I think it was Knives Out, Glass Onion, whatever, the second iteration, they said this quote, said, "It's a dangerous thing speaking without thought as if speaking the truth." It's a dangerous thing speaking without thought as if speaking the truth. Thought requires time and education and filling yourself with knowledge and then mulling that over before you open your mouth to speak. And because when you speak, then you have the actions that go along. And sometimes they don't align, I get that. But you are walking out what you've spoken. And the question is the work that I'm doing harming or helping? And if I'm harming, then am I okay? Can I live with the harm that I'm creating in this world? As an educator, as a leader, as a parent, as a community organizer, I don't want to look back over my life, and none of us should want to look back over our life to see and look at the collateral damage that we have behind us because of the actions that we've taken in our lives, because we didn't take the time to sit with self and educate self. And we started speaking our thoughts as if it were truth without a solid foundation.
Thanks, Judy. Brian.
Well, I just would like to say thank you to everyone for attending this conversation today. And I hope that you ask yourself what you're going to do with the information tomorrow. Because I think if everybody walks away with at least one small actionable step, then this was all worth it, right? Because we're thinking about how to affirm LGBT plus folks in our educational settings.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Jim and I thank you. Monica would like to do a quick wrap up. Monica, if you're speaking, you're on mute right now, and now you're coming off.
Yes, no, thank you. Just switching over from being an amazed panel participant to member of the panel. I can't thank all of you enough. Carol for working on this, Jim for agreeing to help us craft this, and all the panelists for bringing your truth and bringing your whole selves. This is a rare opportunity for all of us, and so I'm deeply grateful for all of you. I think there was a question about the recording. This has been recorded. We will have to stitch it together again because at one point the recording dropped off. As soon as that's done, we will get it out through our email and our social media for everybody. If any of the panelists, you mentioned several resources, if you want to just send that to Carol and myself, and we can add that to that email and have everything in one place for people who attended, and those of course who weren't able to attend. I think there were two things that I'm left walking away with that I'd like to sort of say out loud and encourage all of us to think of him. One of them is this reframing that came from Carol's initial conversation and from the comments you've all made about the work as being life affirming and being joy affirming. And I think centering that as a part of not just this conversation, but continuing to do some of the work and action. I appreciate that from all of you as a way to figure out how do we do better. I mean, I think Melinda, your comment about sometimes we just need to get out of the way, but how do we do this work better for each other, for the communities within UCEA and for the communities that we have in our schools. I think the last question I'll be left with was about I think someone mentioned it in reference to K-12 educators, but I think it's equally important to us about how we show up in this work and how we show up in our learning and our workspaces. If we say one thing, then we better be out there doing the thing as well. And so how we show up in this work and ultimately how we show up in our leadership around this work. And I think all of you have been, are, and will continue to be, amazing role models for us and really pushing us to do this work better, not just in our classes and our schools and our communities, but within UCEA as well. So again, thank you all very much for your time this evening. I can't wait to watch the recording again. And I look forward to more conversations around this and how do we continue to expand our understanding of this within UCEA and within the field. So muchas gracias. Buenas noches. Thank you again so much. Bye-bye.